We're going to start right off in the first chapter of macros. And so we're going to open up Excel. I want to start creating macros and show you how to get your hands into this so you understand this better. So let's just create a macro. Just click anywhere on the screen, doesn't matter where you click, and open up a blank sheet and simply go to View. So on the right side over here, you have an option called Macros under the View tab. And then you can view your macros. We have no macros at this point, but we're going to record a macro. And I'll kind of show you what this is in the book. Let's just get our hands on it and show you what a macro is, how it works, and how we would use it. So we say record a macro. Okay, now this screen, I've pretty much documented this in the book too. I'll jump over and show you that. I went through and how to create a macro. Here's the macro name. Here's assign a keyboard command and some of the other descriptions in here. So the first one's a macro name. So we want to make a macro name sort of describes what the macro is going to do. In this case, we're going to open up a file. And so we're going to call this open file. And I usually use capital letters just to kind of different words. Now, I don't know if the word open file is a reserved word or not. If it is, then we're going to get an error message when we try to record it. But if you put a 1 on the end of it, then that simply is not a reserved word. So if I use the word sum, for example, well, I assume that sum is a reserved word. But sum1 is probably not. So that's the idea is sometimes I put a 1 on the end to do that. For the other reason why I do that is if I re-record this macro again, say I make a mistake while I was recording it, I can call it 2, and then 3, and then 4. And then, of course, the fourth one is going to be my last one. And then I can go back and clean them up later. That way I won't have to go back and record it, delete it, clean it up, and then record another one. I can just record, put in a number on the end of it here. Now you can also put in a keyboard command. So in this case, we're going to open up a file. If I go to Control B, for example, or just type B right there, see the Control B is a reserved keyboard command. And if you use Control B to write this macro, then the B won't work for bold. If it will override it, basically. When you delete the macro, it will actually work. Now let's go through and put in Shift B. Now a Control Shift B is different than a Control B. So basically, I don't know any Control Shift keyboard commands. I don't know if you do or not. But the idea of that is I use Control Shift for all my macros. And that way, if I use Control Shift, then I know I'm not overriding any specific keyboard command. So that's an area that you can use. That way I can apply a letter to the command. So in this case, I'm going to do a Shift F. And F stands for file. Or I could maybe do an O or something like that. Control Shift O for open a file. So the idea of that is we can do Control Shift O to do that. Now we have to talk about where we're going to store the macro. Now, if you store it in this workbook, that means it will only be contained in this workbook. If you choose the personal macro workbook, that is a system-level storage location. So that means that if I put it in the personal macro workbook, it will be available to any file I open up at any time. So the reason why I would want to do this is because this particular file, I don't want to have any specific file open to run this macro. Now, let me give you an example of and we'll do this a little later too, but if I want to store something here, let's say I was going to do a form. And I write the macro to do something to the form, but I want that macro to be stored in that form. So that would be an example of having one that should be stored in this thing. So that means if I email that form to somebody, I want the macro to go with it. So we're going to put it in the personal macro workbook. Now also, I really do suggest a description. We're going to open up a file and putting some kind of description of what file we're going to open up to put that in there. And the reason why is because I've actually written macros that I thought was the best macro I've ever written in my life. A month later, I had absolutely no idea what it was. How do you figure out what a macro does if you don't remember what it was designed for. You have to run it. That's kind of a waste of time is my point. We're trying to save time using macros. Now we're wasting time because we've got so much junk out there. So I do really encourage you to be sure and put a little description here of what this macro is designed for, what purpose it was supposed to serve, that kind of thing, so that if you ever have to go back, look through a bunch of junky macros, you'll be able to differentiate and say, oh, I remember this, so that was for this, that one was for this. That's all we are at this point. So we're going to put a file name here, the Control-Shift-O possibly. We'll put it in the personal macro workbook, and we'll simply say OK. Now, we're currently recording right now. How do we know we're recording? If you click on the macro dropdown, you can see that it says stop recording. That means we're currently recording everything right now. Now, we have to keep a little quiet because you don't want to get too loud with the recording. Now, wait a minute. What am I recording? Am I recording voice? No, I'm recording commands, aren't I? So in other words, everything I do now is going to be recorded. If I click here, I'm recording that. We're just simply going to go to File, Open. We're going to choose Browse. And we're going to navigate down and find a file. I don't care which file it is. I'll just choose the first file on the list. Click on that file. Choose Open. And we just open the file. Now that's all I want to do, is I just want to open up the file. Maybe this is a file that I usually use. At this point, we're going to go to View, Macro, and we're going to stop recording our macro. So you choose Stop Recording, and we're going to close off the file. So File, Close. Now we're going to run our macro. So we can either click here, go to View Macros to view the macros that are available and run it from here, or we can do a Control-Shift-O. So I'm going to hold the Control and the Shift key down, press the O key, and that simply opens up my file. So all we're doing is we're recording specific keyboard commands that we're running and commands that we're using on the menu. So you just sort of do whatever you normally do, and then you would record that macro. That's what basically a macro is. And you can use this for a lot of repetitive stuff. I'm going to go ahead and close off this file now. So if you have any repetitive work that needs to be done, you can write a macro to record that repetitive operations, and then you can simply run that macro and it will perform that operation for you. And so we want to streamline or do things a little bit quicker. So that's what basically a macro is. Did you get that okay?
Sort of. I mean, I guess like for me, this is Ryan. For me, just I guess if you can sum up what a macro is and what its usage in like 2 sentences. I mean, is it just refer to another task? Is that essentially what it does?
It's a new command that's going to record the operations that you do on the screen. So if you do something that's very repetitive,
yeah,
and you do that every day, and you have to go through the same operation, say it takes you 10 minutes to do. You got to do this. Say you open up this file. The first thing you do is you have to format it. Oh, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And then the next day you get a brand new file. You got to do the same thing over and over again. Write a macro to do that, to record that information. And every time you open up that file, you run the macro.
Got it. Okay.
And it does it in a second. Done. Takes 10 minutes. It reduces down to a half a second.
Got it.
That's
okay.
basically what a macro does. It's just a recording of what you normally do. And so we're going to go through and write a whole bunch of macros today, just so you get a real good feel for how to create a macro. And we'll also go into the Visual Basic Editor in a few minutes and look at that. So a few other things we want to look at first is the Developer tab. And keep in mind that everything we're going to be talking about is documented in the book. So you'll be able to go back and follow the book and even go back and refer to it later. So we want to open up what's called the Developers tab. And then we also want to look at the security level to make sure that we have some security involved here. Let's take a look at those two. So the procedures are right there. So you come over to the screen, go to File, and choose Options. At the very bottom. And then come down to where it says Customize Ribbon. Now there is a special ribbon out here called the Developer ribbon that you can check on, and that provides some macro stuff. You can use the View Macros button, but this is more visible. It's a little bit easier to use. If you write one macro once in a great while, then just go ahead and use the View. But if you're doing a lot of development with it, you can choose the Developer tab, say OK, and that actually puts a new ribbon on top called the Developer, and there's a bunch of macro stuff right over here. So one of the options you want to look at in the Developer tab is the macro security. And there's several ways to get to this, but this is probably the easiest way, is once you have the Developer tab, just choose macro security. And so this simply tells me that, in this case, it looks like my setting is set to disable all macros with notification. Now, a macro is a program, and there could be a program that could have a virus in it. And so you might open up Excel, maybe you get an attachment, and you open up that attachment, and there could be a macro that would automatically run and corrupt your system. So you want to be careful with macros. Internal macros, not an issue, but if somebody emails you a file with a macro built into it, you want to be a little cautious of that. This will not allow that macro to run. It will come back and ask you, hey, this file contains a macro. Are you sure you want to open it? And you can say yes or no. And so if you choose this one, of course, it will run any file that contains a macro. So you want to make sure you keep your security level down to this point. And there are times when I've had to change this temporarily. I worked at a company one time. They had so much security on their system, I couldn't get macros to run at all. So I had to enable all macros and just took on the class. So there are times when I might need to do that. Most of the time, it's going to be that level. And so you make sure that you're set to that level, and that way you have a little bit more security in place. Now, let me kind of take you through the book so you kind of follow along with me. Looks like we created another macro called zooming macro. So let's just create a little zooming macro just to show you. Maybe you open up a file and you want to zoom your screen to a certain level. Maybe it's too zoomed out or something. And so you can run. Let's just come over to Excel. And it doesn't matter which file you have open. And see how it's kind of zoomed out right here? But every time you open a file up, this is the zoom level, and you want to zoom in a little bit closer. So we're going to write a macro. Go to your Developer tab, and we're going to say record a macro. And we're going to call this zoom. I'm not sure if zoom is a reserved word or not, so I'll put a 1 on just to make sure. It doesn't matter. If it is a reserved word, it'll just come back with an error. You'll have to start over. I'm going to put in a Shift Z in here. That would be a good keyboard command for my zoom. And I want to put this possibly in the Personal Macro Workbook so that it's available to any file I open up. And then you want to say OK when you're ready. And all we're going to do is we're going to simply go to View, and we can zoom either 100% like this, or we can choose a little zoom slider and zoom in this way. You can also zoom through this little button here if you wanted to zoom in that way. But all we want to do is zoom our screen about like this is all we're going to do. And then we simply stop our macro. Stop recording. Now, if you close out this file, open up another, see I have this one here. I'm going to do a Control-Shift-Z. It's a zoom screen. So it kind of lays your screen out properly, or this kind of layout. And so it's a real quick way to do that. Now, I could have hit the zoom command, but that was a little quicker, actually, to run the macro to do that. And that's really all it does. So anything you want to do, it could be a little tiny thing, a little command you want to use that takes 3 clicks. You can reduce it down to 1 click, or you can simply do a monster amount of stuff. It takes you half an hour of work, and that will do that, all that half an hour worth of work in just a couple of minutes. So it would be very, very advantageous. Now we're going to talk about a couple of new features that most people need to understand. Now I call this the difference between sanity and insanity. And what I mean is that if you don't understand this feature, you'll go insane trying to get the macro to work for you. So this here is called the absolute macro. And then we're going to run another one called a relative macro. And so we're going to create a macro in two different modes. And to understand the difference between these two is necessary. So come over to a blank sheet. I'm going to practice right now to show you what we're going to do is I'm going to write an absolute macro and click in this box. And then I'm going to simply click in that box, type in my name, my address, and that's all I'm going to do is type in that information and then stop the macro. So that's all I'm going to do is just create this information. And so we're going to start in B. Now up in the macro ribbon up here, you have this thing called use relative referencing. If I check that, now it's considered a relative reference. Now if it's unchecked, it's considered absolute. So it's kind of a check, think of it as a checkbox. Check, it's relative. Unchecked, it's absolute. Okay, so we're going to write an absolute macro, so it's supposed to be unchecked or unhighlighted. We're going to start in B. The absolute macros, your first click is where you want to start typing. So you always have to kind of click next to it or somewhere around it, and then click there for the first click and then go from there. So let's click on B. Make sure you're in the absolute mode. Record a macro. We're going to call this address ABS. And I'll put a 1 just in case I have to re-record if I make a mistake. This is going to be my absolute macro. Now this macro, you could put a keyboard command. I can do a Shift-A for absolute. I can remember that. We'll put it in the personal macro workbook in case we need to use it. I want to build up our library of macros so we can use those for other things. And then we can put our description in here. This is going to put in the address and the absolute location. Is everybody okay with this so far? When you're done, you simply say okay. Now we're currently recording. So if you look up the menu up here in the developer ribbon, there is a thing that says stop recording. So that stop recording means we're actually recording right now. So the first click is go to A, and then we're going to type in our name, hit the enter key, type in our address, enter, type in our city and state, Salt Lake City, and then hit the enter when you're done. That's all I want to do is type in my address. And after you type in your address, stop recording. Now we're going to click out in the middle out here, and I'm going to record it using a relative macro. Choose the relative. Now the relative is checked or highlighted. And now in this case, you don't have to go, you just stay right here is all you have to do. And we're going to record a macro. We're going to call this address, REL, put a 1 on there in case I need it. I think I could remember the word R, Shift R, that will help me remember it. Put it in the personal macro workbook. When you have that typed in, you say okay. Okay, we're recording right now. We're just going to type our name, test 3, test 2 a second. Got it? Stop recording. Now I'm just going to select this and hit the delete key and run my macros. So I do have some keyboard commands. So if you remember, I did an A for the absolute and an R for the relative. So if I do a Control-Shift-A, your guess of where you think it might go to the absolute location. Control-Shift-A, of course it went to the cell A. If I click out in the middle out here and I do a Control-Shift-R, that's going to put it in the relative location or wherever you're physically on the screen. So let me explain which one would be useful for different scenarios. If I have a new sheet, and every time I create a new sheet, I put a title on top of my worksheet. That title is going to contain my name, possibly the department and logo or something of that nature. So I would actually put that title on top of my sheet. Which macro would I write that macro using? What do you think? Absolute or relative?
Absolute.
It's always on the top, right? So therefore, write it with an absolute macro. Now I want to put my name, my department, my phone number at the bottom of the spreadsheet. Where's the bottom? I don't know. It depends on the sheet, doesn't it? Every sheet's going to have a different bottom, or the bottom of the data area. So therefore, that would be a relative macro. Very, very simple ideas. I think it's important if you need it to go to a specific place every time, make sure you write it as an absolute macro. But if you really are moving, if it's moving in different places, then relative. And you can imagine if you were trying to write a relative macro using an absolute mode, it would drive you crazy. You'd never get it to work. So it's kind of a very simple thing. Now what I want to do is go look at the code that recorded this information. So if you click in your developer tab, there's an option here called Visual Basic. Click on that Visual Basic icon and it opens up your Visual Basic editor. So this module here, this is book 1, as you can see. That's the book 1 that I was on. But I didn't record the macro in book 1. I recorded it in the personal macro workbook. And so you should all have a personal macro workbook right here. So it looks like I created 2 modules because I did this from my previous class. You have to double click on the module. You don't just click on it one time. You have to double click to see the code. Sometimes it doesn't open when you do that. So here's my open file macro. And you can see that I put in here, it says range A1.select. Now this is a command. This is a Visual Basic command. It's a very popular command. But basically it goes to range A1 and it selects it. So I'm just putting my cursor in cell A1. And then it says it's using the command called workbooks open. That's the command. That's going to open a workbook. And then it says, okay, what's the parameter for this? Its file name is equal to, and it puts the folder up there where I opened it up. Now, if I open up the wrong file, I can simply change the name here if I wanted to, or if I misspelled it or some issue like that. That's all the command does. And that's exactly what coded the opening up that file. Here's our zoom macro. So it looks like I actually clicked on the macro. I said the active window zoom. Looks like I went to 100, then 110. I kind of went up like this. You probably don't need all of this. You can probably get rid of all this up here and just leave it that one command. So one way we can do that, if I click this little single click out here, instead of deleting it, I'm just going to comment it out. So a lot of times I would just comment things out just to make sure, because if it didn't work for some reason, then I would go back and correct it. But if I delete it, then I won't know what it was before. So a lot of times I'll just comment all that out because all I want to do is zoom to 160. Because I clicked my zoom slider a couple of times, and each time I clicked it, it recorded each click. So that I could clean that up a little bit. Let's look at our addresses here. So the absolute macro looks like it actually went to range A1.select. Now, we just looked at that command a minute ago. That's going to go to A1, correct? It's physically going to go to A1. No matter where I'm at on the screen, it's going to go to A1 every time. And then it says, go to the active cell. Where's the active cell? We're in A1. See? So there's the active cell is A1. And this command here is a command that puts a value in there. There's another command I like to use. The macros always seem to do this. But if I type the word value, that's an equivalent command is my point. And that makes more sense to me when I use the word value. But sometimes the macros always seem to put this command in there. But if I say active cell dot value is equal to, and then it puts in the word Jeff Hutchinson. Now, if I misspelled my name for some reason, I can change it to Jeff Hutch instead of Jeff Hutchinson. So I can change that. I can make the adjustments here. So on a real simple level, if you misspell the word, you don't have to rewrite the macro just to spell the word. So if I want to type out the word street, I can just type it out completely. If I want to spell out the state, I can do that too. And you can see what it did was it went to active cell, and then it says go to range A2, and then type in this information in cell A2, then go to A3 and type in this information, and then go to A2, and then A4, and then stop. So that's basically what the macro does. Now let's come over here, look at our relative macro. It says go to the active cell. Now where's the active cell? For a relative macro, we don't know where the active cell is. Wherever our cursor is, that's the active cell. So it says wherever your cursor is, that's where we want to start. So we're going to put Jeff Hutchinson in the active cell, and then we're going to go to the active cell, and we're going to offset by 1. So that's going to go down 1. And then we're going to put in this, once we go down 1, then we're going to say now that we're down 1 cell, we can go to the active cell and put in this. And then it's going to go down 1 more, and then it goes to the active cell, and it puts in the...
It goes YX instead of XY.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
It
Okay,
goes,
thank you.
well, it goes XY, goes down first. I call this the rows versus the columns. That's how I refer to it. So it goes down to 1 row over 0 columns. Okay? That's it. And there's a keyboard command that I put in. So that's basically what Visual Basic is. It records any command that you type in. So whatever you need to do, you would just record it, and it would record the actual Visual Basic equivalent for that command, and it would put it in there. Now, this here is a personal macro workbook, and so you can see that you can actually go through this. And we're going to go through this in a little more detail too. But I wanted to show you the code or the results of recording the macro. And what we're going to do is we're going to expand upon this code and put some things in it. Let me show you another example. So if I come down to this absolute macro, come to the last command down here, and I put in a new command. I'm going to call this MSG BOX, box, message box. And I'm going to simply say double quote, finished, double quote. So this is a Visual Basic command that puts a little pop-up box when the macro is finished. And so you can actually insert additional commands in here to do additional things. So sometimes we can actually write our macro and then use that code as part of our Visual Basic coding. And that way we won't have to go back and do it all manually, type it all in. And you can see that the code could start growing after a while if you're doing a lot of formatting issues. Right, so that's basically what it is. Now I'm going to close this out. You don't need to save this or anything. You just simply say close, and it's all tied to Excel. And if I want to run my absolute macro again, it's going to have a new command in there, Control-Shift-A. Well, the other way you can do it is you can click on this little macros button, and you can select it and run it. So I click on that one and hit run, and you see that when it's finished, it actually comes up with a prompt that tells you it's finished. So if you got a macro that takes a long time to run for some reason, you don't really want to start doing other stuff if it's still running, so you just have a little prompt you when it's done to remind you that it's done, and then you continue working. They run really, really fast, so there's not really an issue with how long it takes. That's the basics of using macro. Now, from this point on, what I want to do is to start writing some macros. So we have our relative, our procedures of actually writing a relative and absolute macro. I have a couple other relative and absolute examples in here. There's a relative phone list. Let's create a title. This will put a title on top of our screen, some sort of title. This puts it under the spreadsheet using the absolute. Now this is called a today macro. So let's go ahead and write this macro up, and I'll go through and practice and show you how to do this and the purpose of doing something like this. And then we just have a bunch of other macros. We're going to write a few more macros down here, but we'll start with the today macro. We'll go over to Excel, and we'll click in the middle here. Now, a couple questions we need to ask is, first I need to show you what the today macro is. So if I were to say equals today, and put parentheses around it like that, that's the today formula. It puts in today's date. The problem is that it is dynamic in the fact that tomorrow it'll say 9:15. And so it changes every time you open up the file. So say you don't want it to be that. Say it's an invoice or something like that. And when you place that date in there, you don't want to put in a dynamic date. You want it to stay the date that you actually specified. So there isn't a command in Excel that allows you to do this. So what I do is we're going to type it in here. We're going to say equals today. This I'm practicing again. Put parentheses like this. Now I don't want to hit return right now. I just want to stay at that cell. So a nice little trick that I've learned is that if I go to the Home ribbon tab, and here's the AutoSum function, if I hit the AutoSum function once, it actually accepts the answer but doesn't go anywhere. So then I'm going to take that date, I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to paste it right on top of itself, but I'm going to use the paste special command and paste it using the values option, and then say OK. And then I want to get rid of this little marquee around there, so I'm going to hit my escape key on the keyboard, which turns off that thing. Now you can see now I have a static date. So let's go through and write a macro to do that. So the question I have for you is this. Do we write this as a relative macro or an absolute macro? And it kind of depends then. So if you wanted to go to a specific location on an invoice, then you're right, it would be absolute. If you're applying that to different sheets, but you want to put a static date in different locations, then we need to do it as relative. So we can do it absolute. We'll just put it in A1 right here. We can write it as an absolute macro or a relative macro. Depends on the purpose of the use of this. So we're going to go to our developer tab, go to A1. Now here's your relative or absolute. We want to make sure that it's in absolute mode when you start, unhighlighted, quarter macro. We're going to call this static date. Now, I'm assuming that that is not a reserved word. If I have to re-record it for some reason, that would save me a little bit of trouble. Now, we could put it in, let's don't put this in as a keyboard command. Let's create a button to put this in. So what you'd have is a little button on the screen that you just click on that button and it would add that date in there. Now, the question we have is this. Should we put it in the personal macro workbook? Say this is an invoice. Or should we put it in this workbook? I kind of think this workbook, don't you? Because what if you email that invoice to somebody? You kind of want that macro to go with it, don't you? Okay, so let's put it in this workbook. So there's an example of using this workbook. And then we have our description. So we're not going to put in a keyboard command. We're going to create a button for this in a minute.
Wait, I have a question. So if you were to put it in this workbook, does that mean that if you were to open up another invoice, you wouldn't be able to use that static date?
No, as long as you have that file open, you'd be able to run that program.
Regardless, so you'd have to have that one file open and then you can do it for any other Excel sheet?
Right, right. But if you put it in this workbook, then it will always work on this one. So you're right. Maybe you want to put it in the personal macro workbook. So what do you think? With your suggestion, should we put it in the in the personal macro workbook, so it's available to us on new sheets, right?
Why wouldn't you put out all these macros in a personal macro workbook?
I'll show you a next example where it's very valuable to have it in this workbook, okay? But most of the time, you're right, it is going to be in the personal macro workbook because you want it to be available.
Yeah.
But these are the decisions you have to think about. See, a lot of times people don't think about these things when they're writing macros. They just write the macro. But then it kind of limps along. It doesn't really work because they didn't really put it in the right place. They didn't make the right decisions. So let's put it here so it's going to be available to us on any new invoice we open up. And I'm going to start in B and then record the macro and then click in A as a starting point. All right, so start in B, record a macro. This time, since I already had that static date, and I already did a 1, I'll just put a 2 here just in case it got saved away. Sometimes you have to re-record it 2 or 3 times, and it saves you a little bit of time to have to go back and fix that. We can fix it later, but say OK, click in A, equals today, parentheses, don't hit the enter key, go to the home ribbon tab, hit the auto sum 1 time, which will do it. You could have hit the return and you'd have to go back is all. And then we're going to copy it, and then we're going to paste it using a paste special, and we're going to use the values option. And then we're going to say OK to that, and then we're going to simply stop our macro. Are you with me still?
Yes.
I'm going to hit my escape key because I want to get rid of that marquee. There's my escape. Then I'm going to go to developer, stop recording, rid of it. Now we're going to create a little button next to it here. Insert, shapes, and we're going to choose a real simple rectangle shape. Any shape will work. Any picture will work. And we're going to draw that picture right out here. And I'm going to call this static date. That's the name of the button. We'll size it down a little bit. It's a little smaller. And when you click on that button, it should put the date in. Right-click on that button, come down to where it says Assign Macro, and assign the static date to that button. So you right-click on the button, assign a macro, and look for my static date. It looks like it did record both of them. See it? So I wanted to stop that. Say OK. And then when I click on that button, what's the date appear? See? Every time I click that button, it's going to put the new date, the current date, in that position and make it static.
Does that mean that every time you open up a file, you'll see that button?
Yeah. So if I save this file off, say this is an invoice or something, file, save as, and we can put it in, I'll put it somewhere where I make sure I can find it here. It's my data folder. I can call this invoice template. This is my invoice template. And I will take the date out for the invoice template. And every time I open up this file now, I open up Excel, and I open up a new invoice template, and there's my button. See it? So then I would click on the static date to add that date to that particular item.
Would I be able to replicate that to another invoice, let's say?
Yes, the code or the button.
The button.
You'd have to either cut and paste the button or something like that.
I see. Okay.
And we could have put this actually in this workbook, because if we put it into a template, right, then that template, every time we open up that template, then we would have that button and the code. See, so we could have done it either way.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to get you in that you have to kind of make that decision, relative, absolute, and also where you're going to store the macro in the, thing. So let's take a look at the code. You want it? So if you go to developer, go to Visual Basic, and slide this. Here's my static date 1. See that? And I kind of made that mistake there. I can delete this code, get rid of it, keep my static date 2, and it looks like it's going to go to range A1, select. It's going to put in the word today in there, as you can see. And then it's going to copy it. Then it's going to use the paste special. It looks like it puts in all these values in here. This command here is actually the escape key that I did to get rid of the marquee. So that's the code for that. So essentially, that's all it really does. Now, it did put a lot of extra junk in here, because technically all we need is the paste values feature, but it put in a bunch of default values in here. So we could actually get rid of this. Now, this underscore right here is a carryover. That means that this is one command, but it didn't have enough room on the screen, so it actually put this little thing, and this is actually part of this command. So you'd have to actually, you could do that. You can add that in there that way. So let's open up another file. Let me show you an example. This could have worked well with this template as putting this in this workbook. So you could do that. Now, we could still do that now. Let's go back to our Visual Basic editor. I was going to show you this a little later, but here's a good opportunity to do this. So I got the static date 2 here. I can take this code and copy and paste it into my invoice template. But you notice there's no module in here. See that? So you have to go to Insert, a new module. And then I can simply take this code and cut it out. Edit. Cut. And then come over to my invoice template and paste it. Edit. Paste. And now I just moved it over to the invoice template. So now that this code is no longer in my personal macro workbook, it's in the invoice template. So every time I open up the invoice template, then I will be able to run this code. That code will be part of that invoice template. See? But we could have gone either way with that. Depends on what you're really looking for, what you're doing. Now, you might use that code in other sheets. So therefore, you might want to put it in the personal macro workbook. It really depends. Okay. Now, let's go and open up a file. Go to File, Open, Browse. Come down to where it says User. Thought I had a user input form. Yeah, there it is. User input form. See it? Alphabetize it. Oh, user input form. Okay, this is a form. Now, if I create a macro, what I want to do on this macro is when I open up this form, somebody actually typed in their information in the form and saved it off as a form. And so I have to start my stuff, so I have to either have to delete their stuff or override their stuff. So I'm going to come along and I'm just going to delete it like this, and then I'm going to simply start typing my stuff in. Okay? Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a macro to do that for me. I'm going to put a button right here, and we're going to call that macro reset, a reset macro. So we're going to click on the reset, and all it's going to do is delete the stuff and then come back to A1 and let me start typing. Okay? Very simple macro, but very useful. Let's talk about how we want to record this. Now, do we want to record it as an absolute reference, or do we want absolute as a relative? It's in a physical location, isn't it? So this form isn't
Right.
moving around. It's in a physical, absolute location. So we can record it as a absolute macro. Okay? You agree with that?
Mhm.
Now, so that, make sure you're unhighlighted there. We're going to click in D, and the first click is going to be here and then do the work, okay? So we're going to start in D. We're going to record our macro. We're going to call this reset. Now, I don't know if there's a command. Let's put a 1 out there to make sure. Now, we're not going to use a keyboard command because I'm going to create a button to do this. Do we want to put it in the personal macro workbook or in this workbook?
I would say this workbook.
Now, what if you email this form to somebody? You want that macro to go with the form, correct? So we will put it in this workbook so it will be self-contained within this. Okay, we're ready to go?
I have
Okay.
a question. Why would someone want this macro if it has our information?
What did I
Oh,
put?
it's a
What?
reset.
Oh,
Not,
yeah,
never mind, never mind.
reset. Yeah. Okay. So I recorded just now. Click on Josh. Delete, enter, delete, 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 delete. And then we're going to take our mouse and click back to A1 or B2. So we're going to start there, and that's all I want to do is just delete the stuff that's in the form and start over. So we're going to stop recording. That's really all I wanted to do. I'm going to put the stuff, I'm going to do a Control Z and put the stuff back in here, by the way. It's there. Now we're going to create a button. This rectangle tool. And we're going to call this button Reset. And I can shrink that down a little bit so it's a smaller button. And we have to assign the Reset macro to the button. We'll right click, assign a macro. There's my reset. It's okay. Now if I want to reset my form, I would just click the reset button and it resets the form. Very simple macro, but it seems pretty powerful. Okay. So when I save off this file, if I go to File, Save As, I can't save it as an XLS file. I have to save it as a macro-enabled file. So this is a macro-enabled file, meaning when you have macros built in the file, then you want to make sure you save them off as a macro file, and that way Excel knows that this file contains macros. So if you'll get an error message if you try to save it off as an XLSX file. But if you save it off as an XLSM file, so I'm going to call this my user input form. I'll call this user input form 2, just so I keep the old file there. Save it off. Now this file is now a macro-enabled file. And if somebody had typed in their information in here by accident, as you can see, all I have to do is hit the reset button to clear it out. It saves a little bit of time, see? I've even seen situations where you might have a button that might type in the information. Say it's a form that you fill out on a regular basis, an expense form or something. And every time you open up the expense form, you have to type in your name, your phone number, your address, all the basic stuff that you normally do. You can run a macro to do that for you. Right? So you just run the macro, and what does it do? It types in your name for you. So if you do have anything that's redundant like that you can write a macro to do it, that would work just fine. So the question is, can you write a macro to do? What is it designed for? What can you write a macro to do? Any thoughts? How about anything you want it to do? That's the key, isn't it? Whatever you want it to do, you can write a macro to do that. Now the question is, will it always work? Now there's going to be little problems here and there, but you'll have to kind of work around those problems a little bit. And we can go back and look at these macros to see how it actually what it actually did. And absolute macro is going to put the absolute positioning in there, and we can kind of go from there.